We're here now for the final keynote addresses of the evening, first by our distinguished guest, Dr. Ian Bremmer, pardon me, who's the president of the Eurasia Group. Eurasia Group is a global political risk consultancy firm. Started in 1998 and now has grown to having offices in New York, London, Washington. The Eurasia Group's also developed a global risk political index that's been certified by Wall Street. And so we're very delighted to have Dr. Bremmer here to, I guess, round out the discussion on global challenges. I think that over the last 2 days we've looked at certainly global issues from global health, global security, cybersecurity, et cetera. And I think that his perspective will really give us some of the mesh and the tissue that brings it all together. So if I could ask him to come to the stage and welcome him. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Close out the conference. It's an honor. It's a privilege. It's a surprise. It's a surprise because I'm not sure how many of you know, but one of the things that I talk about a fair amount is this concept that I came up with, the G0. Right? Implies that we don't have a G7, we don't have a G20, we have an absence of global leadership. And I am keynoting the Creative Leadership Summit, which implies a certain level of perverseness on the part of the conference. But I like that, right? I like that. And to be fair, I mean, the way I would really think about it is in the absence of global leadership, we have to think more creatively about leadership on the world stage. And how can we do that? Okay, do I really believe that there is an absence of global leadership? Yes, I do. I mean, this is not just a model. I'm not sugarcoating it. I think it's very different. We've lived for many decades in a world of US-led globalization, US-led institutions that came out of World War II. The US was the only man standing. We created the institutions, the United Nations, an organization which today is possibly the most unaptly named in the entire world. The Security Council and the GA, the World Bank and the IMF, the Bretton Woods Accord on currency. All of these organizations sound global. I love to say that the World Bank sounds global in the same way that the World Series sounds global. Canada is in the Major League Baseball, but doesn't make it global. And the fact that there are lots of other countries involved in the World Bank doesn't make it global either. All these organizations were created by the United States, American values, American priorities, American capital, American allies. We built up lots of other countries, Japan with MacArthur, the Europeans with the Marshall Plan, and we said, play by our rules. Thank you very much. And that's the way it worked for a very long time. So the global economy worked. Not the Soviet Union, not the East Bloc, but we didn't need them. We didn't need them for our economy and for globalization to grow. And when Tom Friedman writes about the world is flat, he gets that. And he was right at the time. But if he wrote that book today, he'd be wrong. And he'd be wrong because since 2008, we're not anymore in the US-led globalization world. 2008 was the straw that broke the camel's back. Let's be clear. What's the camel? The camel is not the United States. The camel is US-led global institutions. Those are gone. Going forward, there will either be US-led organizations that are not global, or there will be global organizations that are not led, or there will be neither. Those are our options. Creative leadership, it's going to be different. So let me address creative leadership a little. Let me actually get into what I think about that. We have been in an environment of US-led global trade architecture. But the Doha round, which was meant to be the next iteration of more integrated global trade architecture, is dead. Obama thinks it's dead. Romney thinks it's dead. So instead, what are we doing? We are actually trying to create new architecture that is smaller, but is deeper. The Trans-Pacific Partnership. United States, Canada, Mexico, Japan, Indonesia, Australia, New Zealand. A smaller group of like-minded countries. If it works, and I think it probably will, if it works, by 2014, 2015, you will have a group of 12 countries that will represent together roughly 40% of the world's GDP in a stronger, more durable, integrated trade and capital flow agreement. That is more efficient for that 40%. It is less efficient from a global perspective than having everyone together. Will the Chinese be invited? No. Why not? Because they don't agree with us on a lot of stuff. How about the Brazilians? Not planning on it. Russia? Not going to happen, right? So on trade, US-led architecture fails globally. It stops. But we have been creative in trying to come up with other architecture. We are not in trade. We are trying not to allow the great to be the enemy of the good. That will be a consistent worldview of mine, is that if you want leadership in a G0 environment, you must not allow the great to be the enemy of the good. Okay, let's talk about an area where we have not done that. And there are many. I could talk about Syria. That's a good one. I could talk about Libya. That's another good one. But let's instead talk about climate, because that's an even better one. Right? We just saw 2 days ago that the polar ice cap, another record. It's great that we can still set records, USA. We're at 22% coverage as opposed to, I believe it was 27, but now it's coming back, so we don't have to worry about it for another year. We've had a lot of summits, a lot of global summits on climate. We had that Copenhagen summit, failed. But then we had Cancun, failed. Durban, failed. Rio plus 20, failed. They're becoming somewhat more successful in the sense that our expectations have gotten lower, so we are closer, right? I teach at Columbia for fun, so they don't pay me, but I enjoy it. And this was my first class this year, a couple weeks ago, and I asked my students, I said, how many more global climate summits do we need to have fail before we stop having global climate summits? And one of my students raised his hand, and he said 7. 7's not a bad answer. It's probably not 2 or 3. We probably need some more. It might not be 10. I'm with 7, okay? But the point is, we do not have creative leadership on climate. Are we clear on that? Right? Now, what does that mean? That means that some of the countries that are most affected by climate in the near term will have to act by themselves. The Maldives, which are going away, so they buy land in India, so they can move their people to where there will still be a place. Won't be a country, but they can live, right? The rest of us, if we move over the next few years, we'll have maybe a small group of like-minded countries that will start dealing with mitigation. If it takes us longer, it'll be adaptation. If it takes us longer than that, it will be geoengineering, which is really problematic because, not because I disagree with geoengineering, that's an open question at this point, but because if you have several different groups of countries doing different types of geoengineering and they're not coordinated, that probably causes conflict, right? So we haven't gotten to the point of creative leadership on climate yet. Syria. 18 months, 20,000 plus deaths. I look at the events over the last week. Bashar Assad looks like a comparative winner to me. The Russians are absolutely going to use the events of Libya, Egypt, Pakistan, and other places to dig in their heels more firmly and say, you see, fool me once on Libya, you do not fool me twice on Syria. We're not going to countenance any further efforts to squeeze our friend and ally Bashar Assad. They might not say friend and ally. After all, the U.S. is not saying friend and ally on Egypt, so they won't say friend and ally on Syria. But the United States and the Europeans will also be much more reluctant to provide support for a Syrian opposition that they do not know, which clearly includes radical elements that will look the same as some of those that have planned a terrorist attack against the U.S. consulate in Benghazi. What does that mean? Well, it means Syria's going to get worse, and it means we are going to see more spillover of that conflict into Turkey and into Lebanon, refugees streaming into Jordan. Here's the problem. The problem is that if Syria explodes, that's a problem for the United States, not good. But it's a much bigger problem for the Europeans and for the Turks and for the Saudis. It's actually not as big of a problem for the United States, right? I mean, Afghanistan is going to explode, right? I mean, we're taking our troops out, and it's not going to function. We know that. But that's a much smaller problem for the United States than it is for Pakistan or India or China. Now, I was, a few months ago, I met with some Chinese officials, and I asked them, I said, well, you know, the Brits did Afghanistan, and the Soviets did Afghanistan, and the Americans did Afghanistan, so isn't it your turn? Right? And they said no. They said, no, that's a disaster. We're not touching it. The Chinese won't touch it. The Chinese have no interest in stepping into that breach. Now, I want to say, I think there are several reasons for this, right? There are several reasons for why the G0 will persist. And I want to kind of lay them out briefly right now because it gives you a sense of the challenges that must be overcome to get towards creative leadership. Number one, very simple, too many countries. Too many countries that matter. You've got a coordination issue. Why is Europe so hard to fix? Even among just the Europeans, because we're not doing it. There's no Marshall Plan coming from the United States anymore, right? And the answer to that is because all of these different countries have different constituencies, different electoral cycles, even though they're relatively like-minded in terms of general political and economic values at the macro level. You talk about the G20, the world's 20 largest economies, you have coordination issues. It is just harder. Not just because some countries are intransigent and say no, but because everyone likes to talk about modalities, which is like the word of death for diplomatic discussions. We must discuss modalities. It takes a long time. Modalities means 6 months plus, right? That's what a modality means. So that's one reason. Number two, which is more pernicious. Everyone knows Fareed Zakaria. Love Fareed Zakaria. Who does not know Fareed Zakaria? I mean, not personally, just kind of know. I'm using not the biblical sense. I'm just saying generally know. No, everyone here doesn't know him now. I don't think so. But that would be interesting. Let me say, he talks about the rise of the rest. The rise of the rest. I think he's wrong about that. It's the rise of the different. That is a distinction that matters. We are talking about countries that are poor. And therefore, they have different priorities. And they should. If they're poor, they will view climate differently than if they're rich. Because the priority of ensuring a level of economic growth, the priority of ensuring low food costs, given the impact of that on a person's basket, matters very differently. They have different political systems. They have different economic systems. That is most true of China, which is a state capitalist economy. It is an authoritarian political system. Furthermore, they have different capacity, and this is even more important. So India has 1.1 billion people. New Zealand has 4 million people. But New Zealand has more diplomats than India. Now, when we talk about trying to fix global problems, we rarely talk about New Zealand. We talk about India a lot. Now, even if the Indians were inclined to actually try to step in and help on Syria, and help on peacekeeping, and help on trade, and help on climate, they literally don't have the people or the capacity. China does not have the experience of multinational corporations to act globally in the way that the Americans, the Brits, the Canadians, the Japanese, the Europeans do. It has taken the advanced industrial democracies decades, in some cases centuries, to build out this capacity. The emerging markets have grown from tiny to where they are today in 30 years. They have not built this capacity. They cannot build this capacity for a very long time. They will not have the capacity to lead. That's why we will not get a G2. We will not get US-China acting in that fashion. We will not get responsible stakeholdership, as Bob Zoellick wants to say. We will not get the kind of behavior from China that will allow Hillary Clinton to say, yes, we welcome China's peaceful rise. We will not. We will see structurally more conflict between these countries. The good news is that in the Cold War, the fundamental driver of geopolitics was much more security. And security issues create dilemmas. They create zero-sumness. If I have more security, frequently my antagonists have less, necessarily. Hence arms races. At least today, geopolitical balances are driven not only by geosecurity, but also by geoeconomics. So you have fights on North Korea, you have fights on the East and South China Sea, which are clearly zero-sum, but you also have extraordinary interdependence between the US and China economically, which means that at the same time that we are engaging in constructive behaviors together, we are also engaging in destructive behaviors together. And that is consistent, and that will continue. We'll deal with that. Am I worried about the Chinese no longer investing in the dollar? I am not. Am I worried about cyber war between the US and China having massive implications on trade and cooperation? Yes, I am. Different story. So that's the second reason. The third reason is that the Europeans and the Japanese are busy. I mean, Merkel, for the last 2 years, possibly has shown the most effective leadership of any major governing official in the world, but it has been overwhelmingly morning, noon, and night on Europe. That's it. That's it. Although she did take 3 weeks off in August, right? And it was interesting because so did Christine Lagarde, so did David Lipton of the IMF. And for those 3 weeks, it's like everything in the European crisis was quiet, which made me think, if Merkel could take off a year, then it would be okay. So the Europeans are busy. They can't do this stuff. The Japanese go through prime ministers roughly every week. They've had 18 in 22 years. That is a modern-day Asian record. Noda-san is probably going to go down in the next year. They have just gotten out of the worst year since Hiroshima and Nagasaki with the 3/11 Fukushima crisis, and now they have this crisis with China that probably has much more impact on them over the next 10 years than the Fukushima crisis has. They are not going to play this role. Fourth, final reason, the United States doesn't want to. Our willingness to be the global policeman, our willingness to be the lender of last resort, our willingness to drive globalization is less than it used to be. Yes, it's deficit issues. Yes, it's growing gap between rich and poor. Yes, it's a more complicated global environment, but you put them all together, that's just the reality. Any one of those four things would create a crisis in pre-existing global leadership. We have all four together. So we must do this differently. That's the environment we're in. But the interesting thing, I mean, that sounds negative, but the interesting thing is that the United States is actually much less hurt in this environment than most other places. And it's because in an environment that lacks global leadership, volatility gets much greater. In the last week, you look at Xi Jinping being we don't know where, and then back, and then China, Japan blowing up. You look at the Middle East blowing up all over the place, and Pakistan, and a little Indonesia. You look at the issues around the German Constitutional Court, and the Dutch elections, and the Portuguese possibly having coalition fracture. You look at the Indian government, which thinks it's going to do Big Bang reform, and then all of a sudden isn't. And you look at QE3 in the United States. I run the world's largest political risk organization. We have 150 people. And in the last week, our analysts, we've had more analysts 24/7 real-time following conflicts in their areas than at any time since the first week of the 2008 financial crisis. This is a busy time. It is a high volatility time. And that's structural. When you have structurally high volatility, you pay less attention to growth. You move more in that environment towards resilience. The US is underperforming in growth. I know that. But the level of stability of the United States is much higher. The US is a safe haven. In fact, despite the fact that the United States has not fundamentally addressed its deficit, and will not in the next at least couple of years, in my view, the US has more ability to attract people to the dollar today than they did before the financial crisis started. We have more ability to do more quantitative easing if we want to. We have more ability to attract people to American equities. Why? Because everything else is structurally so much more dangerous. And I'm not just talking Europe and Japan. In fact, not principally at all. I'm talking about all these emerging markets doing all of this growth. which will look scarier going forward because they've got the growth but much more volatility. That is a real change. All right? The only thing you hear about a lot of oil-producing economies, the oil curse. And it's because they don't need to do political and economic reform because they can pull money out of the ground. The only thing easier than pulling money out of the ground is pulling money out of other people's pockets, which is precisely what the U.S. can do and will continue to be able to do. $16 trillion deficit. How long can this last? The answer is longer, given the G0 and the last 4 years of crisis and the geopolitical creative destruction and the lack of creative leadership, longer than it otherwise would have been. The bad news is that means the U.S. can continue to avoid taking the tough decisions. But the good news is we really do have more time than people think. I mean, there is bad news in the U.S. I was in Harrisburg last night, which was generally bad news. And I actually like Harrisburg, but it is very sad. The unemployment is very high. The place is completely bankrupt. Crime has gone up. Violent crime has gone up a lot. And it was an audience of several hundred folks. And it was kind of all of the business community and the government community in Harrisburg. And I asked them at the beginning how many of them, show of hands, believed that the United States was in a state of decline. About 70 to 75% of them raised their hands. That's depressing. That's depressing. But I understand it because in many parts of the United States, the gap between rich and poor and the belief that Americans will benefit from the fact that they are a safe haven has gone down, and rightfully so. You look at the New York Times today and you see what has happened to the gap in longevity between the wealthy and the educated and those that don't have that opportunity. That is pretty stark. And you can see that in marriage figures, you can see it in health figures, you can see it in employment figures. It is very clear. That is the problem, but that is not a problem of the United States in the rest of the world. That is a problem of how the U.S. relates to its own citizens. It's a domestic issue. So bottom up, we have this challenge that's getting bigger. Top down, we're actually in better shape than we were before. That does relate to one other issue and why we will not see changes in either of those soon. In 1974, 3% of congressmen that retired went into the private sector to lobby. Today, that figure is 51% for the Senate. That figure is 44% for the House. And you could say, well, it's just Republicans. Or it's just Democrats. Actually, it doesn't matter. It's the same. And the thing is, if you want to become a lobbyist after you finish your job in Congress, you have to prepare for that. You've got to engage with the private sector. You've got to give a little to get a little, right? That's working. But that is not going to lead to dramatic transition in the way the Americans think of health care, not with the AARP running rampant, right? The private sector and the ability of the private sector to capture interests is absolutely an entrenched feature of U.S. governance. Stability, yes. Resilience, yes. But the willingness to address the long-term structural problems, no, they're not urgent. And because of the lack of urgency and the stability, you will see more gridlock. You won't see us off a fiscal cliff, but you will see more gridlock. So ultimately, the message I have is that we're in an environment where global leadership that we have been used to, not perfect, not great for everyone, but in a way that we understood, in a way that was creating this trend towards more globalization led by the U.S., that's gone. And in its stead is a more challenging environment. It's much more complicated. It will work in some areas, and in some areas it is working. It will not in others, and it will create larger crises. It is less efficient. On balance, it is comparatively good for the United States. And that is the quandary we deal with. I'm delighted to take a few questions at the end of this conference. Again, I thank you so much for inviting me. I hope you found this interesting, worthwhile, provocative, all of that kind of stuff. I'm kind of unplugged when you give me a stage, and I apologize for that, but it makes it fun for me too. So please, let me ask you for your questions. I think there is a microphone that will rove so that you can be heard. Who would like to ask first? Okay, right in the front, because you run this thing. Yeah.
A question, where is the source of global leadership? If there's an absence, is there a source? Is there any way to find it, develop it, created? Is it just a fractured environment that we're in, or is there in fact some hope?
Well, there are some areas where there is global leadership. I look at the global financial reform and regulations, right? And you look at Basel III, and you look at how well that continues to function. And I would argue that the reason for that is because the global financial system is largely very similar to the way it was 20, 30 years ago. Your principal actors are the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, the Fed, and the ECB. They are relatively technocratic organizations. They are relatively unpolitical, not controlled by their governments, though that is changing at the margins. They're small, they're pretty hierarchical, and they've known and trusted each other for a long time, right? The People's Bank of China is not a relevant actor on this stage because China doesn't have a banking system, right? I mean, there's a global financial crisis? No, there wasn't. There was a financial crisis in the developed world, and China had a little bit of a slowdown, but they didn't have a financial crisis because you can't short China, right? So there are some areas where global leadership still functions, but in most themes, in most issue areas of the world, you are seeing absolutely a fragmentation. That fragmentation is greater in some areas, less in others. You think about the U.S. and the U.S. still has extraordinary dominance on the security side, spends more on its military than the next 12 countries combined. If the U.S. wanted to field and be everywhere as the world's policeman, it has the capacity to still do that. But, I mean, Romney didn't even mention Afghanistan in his Republican National Convention speech, despite the fact that Obama expanded the war and is losing it. Why? Well, because first of all, Americans want out. And second of all, to the extent that Republicans care a lot, they're very differentiated in their views. And third of all, Romney can't win on foreign policy. So not happening. But in Asia, the United States is actually engaging in a much more serious way. And I would certainly say that from the perspective of the Philippines or Vietnam, leadership globally on the security front hasn't really changed all that much, but they feel much more of an incipient threat from the Chinese. And over time, they will need to make a choice. And they'll need to make a choice because, number one, why will the United States keep providing that security over 10, 20 years if it's getting harder to do so from an American economic perspective and they don't feel like they're getting benefits? Number two, more important, why does China allow these countries to maintain these security ties with the United States when China's economic influence over them and therefore political influence is expanding radically? And that is a very interesting question to answer, right? So I think it's a mixed answer to your question. It's a tough question, but on balance, for most of the environment, I actually think the G0 applies. And none of these models are perfect. They're all used, you know, sort of as a way to sort of a filter to frame the way you think about the world. But again, broad brush, I think that global leadership as we've defined it has cracked, and we will rebuild in different areas in different ways. It's going to be messy. Question over there.
Do you think that there's scope for maybe a public-private partnership at a macro level being a source not just for growth, potentially depending on the country, but also actual leadership?
No. I think there used to be. I think that since 2008, the state has become more important. Public-private partnerships that are global are much easier to do when you have common values and common political and economic space. Multinational corporations become more important in that environment. Super-empowered individuals become more important. NGOs become more important. In an environment where it gets fragmented and people don't agree on values, that's when the Russians kick USAID out, right? We used to have global internet space, and you could have public-private partnerships that would help to figure out how best to use and advance the internet. But when the Iranians are setting technology up to develop their own internet with help from Huawei in China, and when Facebook has an IPO, it doesn't go very well, but still it's meant to be global, but you have over 500 million Chinese that will not participate, you no longer have a global World Wide Web, right? It's fragmented. And public-private partnerships will work really well within those spaces, but they won't work well from a macro perspective. So absolutely, public-private partnerships will become much more important, but they won't be global. They won't be, and they'll work very differently in different parts of the world. A public-private partnership that is effective in China will look radically different than one that works in the Middle East, than one that works in the US, Europe, Japan, than one that works in Eurasia. They will be facilitated by different things. They will be challenged by different things. I think that is a real fundamental different way in how we think about the interconnection of public and private. Sir, we got a bunch. How much time? Do I have time to take these? Tell me.
Maybe, do you want to...
Okay, let me round these up and I'll answer all of them, and then I know I have to be off. But all three of you I'll take. Yeah, go ahead.
What keeps
at the same time,
okay.
and then I'll pick the one
Sorry.
that sounds interesting. Okay,
Okay.
I'm taking
What
notes.
keeps you awake at night?
How long is it before this domestic issues that you talked about become a crisis in this country? And does it matter whether Romney or Obama wins the election?
Ooh, what a hard question. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. So is it a G0 for technology and innovation as well? The U.S. has been pushing hard, patent and IP rules but has been unable to do so the last 10, 15 years other than the TPP. So do you see this as being another G0 environment?
Yeah. Okay. I'll start with that. I'll go backwards. Those are three tough questions. I'll try to be brief, even though they're three very tough questions. Technology, I think the answer is yes for the time being. Because when one American company gets hit on this issue, all their competitors say, we want in, right? When Google got hit by China, Yahoo said, we don't have a problem. We love China, right? When Boeing gets hit by China, and Airbus comes in, and GE says, we'll sell you those engines, they undercut each other. And they don't want to work together. And furthermore, they certainly don't want to work with the US government. And they certainly don't want to work with the Department of Commerce in the US government, right? Who don't come from the private sector and they feel interfere and don't understand regulatory process and all the rest. This is a challenge. The US does not have METI, right? The Japanese are actually better set up for this kind of stuff. Doesn't mean they do it effectively, but they're better set up. The US has a great State Department. They have a CIA that's incredibly well resourced and collects information on everything. But on industrial policy or economic statecraft, we're trying to run it out of the State Department right now. Look, Hillary Clinton is doing a pretty good job in articulating the issues. And if Romney wins, Bob Zoellick would do a pretty good job on articulating the issues. If Obama wins again, Susan Rice would not do a pretty good job in my view. John Kerry would. So that's interesting. But I think on balance, I think structurally the US government is not well set up for this. Now, having said that, I look at a company like Bayer, which does its IP and development of drugs all over the world, and then India gives a patent to an Indian company and says, you know what, this drug that Bayer sells, you've got a patent now to sell it in India for 3% of the cost of what Bayer sells it for. And you know what? That does not mean that Bayer is done. That means that people are going to stop investing for R&D in Indian pharma. That's what that means. So, I mean, what I think is interesting, when China becomes the world's largest economy, and they will, China will not, America will still be the world's largest economy with rule of law and with IP protection. And that is important. That is important over the long term and sustainability. Okay, so relatedly, does Romney or Obama matter a lot? And the answer is no. And we know that. I mean, we get ideological about it. We get excited about it. The tone is very different. But in terms of engagement with the rest of the world, the differences are relatively small. I mean, I know Romney says that they'll declare China a currency manipulator on day one if he wins. That's a lie. But Obama lied about closing Guantanamo. I mean, this happens, right? It's politics. When it's Karl Rove versus Axelrod, we should not pay it. We should not try to read policy tea leaves out of that, and we don't. We're grown-ups. We know. But I'm not saying it doesn't matter at all. And certainly in terms of tax policy and all the rest, Americans will be affected. There's no question. But if you talk to me broad brush about the U.S. and dealing with the deficit and all of that. No. We know this, right? I mean, things are much more structurally entrenched than that. The U.S. is much more stable. It's much more gridlocked. It responds to crises, and it responds to crises in ways it needs to. Winston Churchill said this: the U.S. always does the right thing after extinguishing every other option. That's Democrat or Republican, right? That's what they said. How long do we have? Again, longer than we think. I mean, I don't think it's 5 years. I don't think it's 10. I think it's longer than that. Furthermore, the U.S. has the demographic advantages with immigration, which helps to growth, and when growth happens, that affects the deficit. Overwhelmingly, the innovation comes out of the U.S., unconventional oil and gas. The next big things will still largely be U.S., and that does matter. We don't know what they are yet, but still it's important. Final question, what keeps me up at night? Nothing does, because I'm tired at the end of the evening, and I sleep well. But, I mean, there are a lot of things that worry me. I'm not worried about Israel attacking Iran, for example. I'm not worried about that. I'm not really worried about North Korea blowing up because I have no way of assessing it, and neither any of you. So it's kind of like if it happens, okay, but I'm not worried about H1N1, same sort of thing. I'll tell you what I'm really worried about because I expect it. I'm worried about WikiLeaks in China. That's what I'm worried about, right? WikiLeaks hit the United States. And we had tens of millions of documents that were made, classified documents, that were made public from the State Department, ambassadorial cables, stuff from Hillary, and everyone read it. And you know what they said? I was in Dubai when it happened. And I was sitting next to, I think it was the Qatari Minister of Finance. And he was like, I think you guys leaked that. That's what he said. I think you leaked that because it makes you look good. And I'm like, well, you know what? If we leaked it, the fact that we leaked it would probably already also leak, so it doesn't really work. But the point was, I mean, what did we learn from WikiLeaks? We learned that Karzai is corrupt, which I know shocks you, right? We learned that Hillary Clinton believes that Cristina Kirchner in Argentina is emotionally unstable, right? Which is widely understood, right? We actually learned that the U.S. State Department is probably the most capable in the world. And they actually take their time, and they do this stuff well, and they write better than The Economist, and that's not bad, right? I'm serious about this. You can be proud of the U.S. that we've got competency exams for the U.S. State Department. I mean, thank God that it wasn't Commerce that got hit by WikiLeaks with Jesus, right? But state USTR would have been good. We do this stuff. If WikiLeaks hits China, and at some point it probably will, China's trying to run a 21st century economy with a 20th century political system. You get millions of documents saying who does what to whom in the Chinese leadership, people are going to get killed, right? They're going to be purges. I don't think China will fall apart. But if that happens, I think a military takeover in China is wholly plausible. And we are not going to like that outcome. And our friends, the Japanese, are not going to like that outcome. I had lunch today with my friend Jared Cohen. You guys might know him, used to be in the White House. He runs Google Ideas, and he is writing a book with Eric Schmidt, which is quite good. It's not out, it'll be out in a few months, on security issues and technology. And I was talking to him about this issue, and I asked him what he thought the likelihood was. I didn't even plant this question, but it gave me a chance to talk about it. I asked him what he thought, if he thought this was plausible. And he said, yeah. And I said, how plausible? He said, well, by when? And I'm like, well, how about the next 5 years? Oh, he's like 50%. Okay? And this guy knows a lot more than I do about this stuff. So I think that's serious. And when I talk about the fact that I think the U.S. looks like a safe market, it's because China can grow at 8%, but they have these vulnerabilities that are structural, that are massive, And we don't yet appreciate how complex and how significant they are. If you're going to be the kind of person that's going to be kept up at night, and I suggest you not be, but if you're going to, that's a good one to lose sleep over, right? That's a constructive one. So thank you all so much. I hope you enjoyed the whole conference and my talk. Thank you for having me.